Indeed, we are staying with live from the SABC's Auckland Park headquarters. Welcome to this Thursday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show this evening, of course, the British Queen is dead. Long live the King. King Charles will be the one taking the reins. That's what we're going to focus on this evening. The Watchdog starts now. Well, British Queen Elizabeth II celebrated a platinum jubilee, and many around the world will be watching, of course, with interest to see how the royal family puts on a brave face and portrays a united front. The family was, of course, as everyone knows, mired in controversy due to the decision of the Duke and the Duchess of Sussex to move to America. Prince Andrew was also embroiled in a scandal. Our international news editor, Sophie Mugwena, looks at the Queen's visits to South Africa since 1947.
Following day marked Princess Elizabeth's coming of age, and a public holiday for Cape Town, the centre of worldwide rejoicing. Very appropriately, the Princess took the salute at a youth rally and thoroughly enjoyed a lively display. Climax of the occasion was the children's version of a familiar birthday greeting.
The young Elizabeth, accompanying her parents, King George VI, and her mother, Queen Elizabeth I. Here, reading a speech on the 21st birthday that coincided with her visit in South Africa. It is on this continent in Kenya, during her visit in 1952, where the young Elizabeth, a newlywed, got a message from her husband, Prince Philip, that her father, King George VI, has passed on.
The tragic news reached Princess Elizabeth and her husband while in Kenya, and the new Queen left immediately for London. Sad homecoming of a young Queen. The Atalanta was punctual, and bearing a message from the Queen Mother, the Duke of Gloucester entered the plane. And then, bravely concealing her emotions, Queen Elizabeth II emerged. With perfect composure, she greeted the Prime Minister and all who had come to meet her. Her Majesty graciously thanked the crew of the Atalanta, and only a few minutes after the arrival, she and the Duke of Edinburgh said goodbye to Mr. Churchill and left the airport for Clarence House.
The incident that completely changed her life. She was back at the southern tip of the continent again in 1995. During the presidency of the late former President Nelson Mandela.
Of course, we come out of that particular package to take you straight to a briefing on the passing of the Queen. Take a listen.
Her devotion to duty is an example to us all. Earlier this week, at 96, she remained determined to carry out her duties as she appointed me as her 15th Prime Minister. Throughout her life, she's visited more than 100 countries, and she has touched the lives of millions around the world. In the difficult days ahead, we will come together with our friends across the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and the world to celebrate her extraordinary lifetime of service. It is a day of great loss, but Queen Elizabeth II leaves a great legacy. Today, the crown passes, as it has done for more than 1,000 years, to our new monarch, our new head of state, His Majesty, King Charles III. With the King's family, we mourn the loss of his mother, and as we mourn, we must come together as a people to support him, to help him bear the awesome responsibility that he now carries for us all. We offer him our loyalty and devotion, just as his mother devoted so much to so many for so long. And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era in the magnificent history of our great country, exactly as Her Majesty would have wished, by saying the words, "God save the King."
Our British Prime Minister making that brief announcement there. Let's get some local reaction to the news, and we do have on the line from the Congress of South African traditional leaders of South Africa, Zolani Mkiva. Mdanengosi
yeyele ngenene kumzi wamangesi ngokubana ikumkanikazi yabo ikhothamile. Thina singumbutho wenkosi zaseMzantsi Afrika iContralesa. We would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere condolences to the royal family of England, the British throne. We also wish to say the same to the citizens of the United Kingdom. We have known the Queen from a distance, but we do know that our country has been connected to Britain through history of coloniality and the relationship, therefore, that we had with them in our quest for freedom. We understand that the Queen was particularly attached and had a sentimental attachment to South Africa in particular for a number of reasons, which have already been expressed, which include the fact that she celebrated her 21st birthday here in South Africa, while South Africa was still the colony of Britain. And secondly, the throne that, the crown that she carried in her head from the time she assumed the responsibility of being Her Majesty the Queen of England. It is particularly made from some of our precious minerals, particularly the diamonds that come from Kimberley, the Cullinan in particular, and we are told that it is worth millions of pounds. There are quite a number of things which makes Britain and the British throne to have a special place in South Africa, because many of their cities are made out of the sweat and the blood of South Africa. And they have been enriched through our minerals, gold deposits. And to date, the gold that comes from South Africa is actually under the stewardship of the British government, particularly the throne. But when someone passes on in the true spirit of Ubuntu, humaneness, which we uphold, even though there are these contradictions that have put us on two sides of the coin as a people. At this point, when someone passes on, we put everything aside and we focus in the dark cloud that has besieged the royal family of England and the British people. And it is in that respect that we want to pay our respects to the elder, one of the long-serving queens in the world, for that matter, because she has taken almost 70 years, as I understand. And we, as I say, we have come to know him, and our leadership here have interfaced with her. But there's one particular thing that we want to say as Contralesa, that this lady, the Queen of England, was loved by her people, respected by the politicians, and they actually paid full allegiance to her, fully supported by the government of that country, highly elevated and actually used as a major export for that country, which attracted millions of people around the world on tourism basis, heritage sites, national key points of that country, which people of the world at all times, annually, on annual basis, they go to that country to go and actually to see those spots. So it is something that is positive, that the British people are united behind their throne, are united behind their royalty, and they give it space, time, and they give it that particular level of respect to the extent that it is the Queen of England that approves when a prime minister is voted by the citizens of that country. She recently did that when the current and the new British prime minister ascended to the highest office of the prime minister. So I think it is something that we can learn. And the contradiction in that it was the British government that wanted to do away with our own kings here in South Africa and Africa, so that all of us, we bow down into the British throne. What is amazing is that even though that was the case, is that you have some amongst us in our shores who want to take forward that agenda, which the British failed to do, because we still have our kings, we still have our queens in our shore. So these are some of the contradictions that we are thinking about at this juncture. But be that as it may, we as Contralesa, we sincerely are giving our utmost support to the British royal family, the British people, the United Kingdom at large. We are with them during this time of difficulty, because that is what we have to do when someone passes on, particularly a figure who is highly regarded by her own people. We have to give them that kind of support. It doesn't mean that we are overlooking the issues that have occurred over time. You know, Queen Elizabeth took over the reins of power in that country in the middle of colonization in the world, when the project of colonizing Africa and other parts of the world was actually at its advanced stage. She continued with that trajectory. And but when we engage here, if I may make an example, the Xhosa royal family, for instance, engaged with the British government, demanding an apology, demanding reparation insofar as the killing of King Yinsa. And they issued a statement to that effect that they regretted, but they never took that regret to the logical conclusion of actually apologizing. So these are some of the issues that we have to reflect upon, we have to think about when we see a chapter that is being closed and the beginning of a new chapter. Prince Charles attended the funeral of our first president, Dr. President Mandela, and it was for the first time that he actually interfaced with King Zwelonke the late. For the first time, a British royal met the Xhosa royal after colonization had gone away.
Okay.
So these are some of the things that we think about at this juncture.
Ndanomhle Masukbulele, thank you very much. That's the Secretary General of Contralesa, Zolani Mkiva. Of course, as he was about to end his tribute, he spoke, of course, of former President Nelson Mandela. And on the line, we do have the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and that's Mr. Silo Atang. Mr. Atang, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Your tribute.
Good evening, Vuyo, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I think on behalf of the Board of Trustees, the staff and management of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, we want to pass our deepest condolences to the family, friends, and the people of the United Kingdom on the passing of Queen Elizabeth. I think a legacy this long, a life this long, will always come with complications. It's a legacy that's big, that's complex, and it always will have things that you'd expect that would be difficult to swallow at a time like this. And for us, we would like to also recognize the kind of relationship that the Queen had with Madiba. And to remind the listeners of some of the stories that people like Ahmed Kasrada used to tell of how he walked into the office and found Madiba on the phone, and Madiba had been saying, Elizabeth, Elizabeth. And after a while, he interjected and wanted to find out who he was talking to. And when the call was done, he asked Madiba, who was that? He then said it was Queen Elizabeth. And it was then that Ahmed Kasrada said to Madiba, but you are not supposed to call her Elizabeth. You're supposed to say Queen Elizabeth. And Madiba retorted, well, she calls me Nelson. Therefore, it should be okay for me to call her Elizabeth. And I think that's the kind of relationship that they enjoyed, and the relationship that she also had with South Africa. We want to also acknowledge that she continued to want to have warm relations with South Africa.
Mr. Sello Hatang, let me thank you for your time. That's the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Mr. Sello Hatang, of course, with a little snippet there, taking us back to the former president's relationship with his Elizabeth. Well, up next, we are, of course, going to continue to bring you reactions from around the world, from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, but also from the European Union and other parts of the world, as the British Queen, of course, has actually passed on, Britain's longest reigning monarch and the nation's figurehead for 7 decades, dying at the age of 96. On the line now, we have Emeritus Professor in History Studies, that's Donald McCracken. Prof, good evening. Thanks very much for your time on a day like this. As Africans and, of course, as a former colony of Britain, what do we say, what do we talk about, with all that history behind us?
It's a historic moment, there's no question about it. And in particular, South Africa can reflect back, because this was the last of the British monarchs, the last of the British kings and queens to be head of the South African state. And that's something in itself. It is the end of colonialism in its most, I don't know, its most extreme form, as it were. And yet the individual herself was an extraordinarily modern person, a very insular person, a very quiet person, but someone who revolutionized the monarchy and changed it, turned it upside down, and I think did so in such a way that she helped create Britain as a multi-ethnic country. Just listen to your previous correspondent, person there about Nelson Mandela, Kenneth Kaunda, too, a great friend of hers. She did not interfere in politics, but she did let it be known what was the right thing to do and what way her country should be going.
When you say, Prof, he revolutionized the monarchy, what specifically, are you referring to?
Well, she modernized it. There's still a way to go, and I think you're going to find in the next couple of years there's going to be some dramatic statements coming out with the new monarch. But she, for instance, she started paying income tax, something that a monarch had never done before. Under her, the old hereditary system of the House of Lords was dramatically, revolutionarily, it was changed. She came in as nearly as the age of the empire and what have you, and she left with a true constitutional monarchy. And I think there's no question about it that Britain will keep its monarchy, but I think it's only going to keep its monarchy because of the personality and the impact of someone who had a great sense of duty. She wasn't very tall. She was a small person physically, but by Jove, she was a very strong person when it came to constitutional change. You know, it was big things and small things. Giving up the royal yacht in itself, and remember that the royal yacht came to Durban about 20 years ago. We had the Queen and we had Prince Philip here. In fact, I met Prince Philip when he was here. A very jolly fellow he was too. The greatest ambassador that Britain could possibly have, and yet, Britain retains its pageantry. I think Britain does pageantry probably better than anyone else in the world. I mean, she an immensely wealthy family, and of course a family which is, is as much a soap opera as anything else, which it always was, incidentally. Even back in the sort of 18th century, you had people in the royal family misbehaving. And yet it is something that sort of symbolizes Britain. So, whatever happens in Britain, I think that the monarchy is going to continue, and it's going to continue because of her.
Lastly, I mean, Prof, granted she was old when it happened, but what do you think of her handling of one of the stories that captured the world, and that is the entry into the royal family of Meghan Markle?
Look, there are things she didn't do well. She was a very old lady when that happened, and I think that has to be taken into account. And I would put the Meghan Markle story alongside the Princess Diana story. And remember how when Princess Diana died, how the flag was not put to half-mast until quite late in the day. So she was not what I thought. I mean, I'm not pretending that she was, but she certainly had the right drift of the way to go. And as I say, that family, you live your life in public. There's no privacy to it. There's no private life. And that's very, very hard. One thinks of, one's own families and all the dramas and the struggles that go on with it. So I'm not trying to excuse her, but I do think that given the circumstances in totality, that historians will be kind to her in the end.
When all has been said and done, Prof, how do you think members or people from her former colonies will remember her?
I think they'll remember her with great affection and admiration and support. What will happen to the Commonwealth, of course, is a different ballgame, and that very much depends on what Charles III does and his attitude, because that's dangerous waters that they're entering into. But I cannot see anything but respect and admiration for the previous monarch.
Do you think the Commonwealth will die with her, so to speak?
I think it has to adapt. I think die is perhaps a bit too sensational. But then the monarchy has to adapt too. The civil list by which people, members of the family, are given, they basically get their salaries from the state. I think you'll find that that's going to be altered quite dramatically. The naming of orders, things like the Order of the British Empire, Member of the British Empire, I think you'll find that they're, if not out the window, they'll have a name change pretty rapidly. So we're actually in for a big time, when it comes to change, but the fundamentals will survive.
And what do you think King Charles will bring to everything that the monarchy has been about or stood for?
Well, I think he's waited an awful long time, and it's going to be one of those situations like when Queen Victoria died in 1901, and her son, Edward VII, came onto the throne. And he'd been a bit of a playboy, he'd been a bit of a rogue, He wasn't really taken seriously, and he only reigned for 9 years because he was an old man when he came to the throne, and he was greatly loved. He actually turned it around. He was a successful monarch, and we're going to find the same thing here because we're going to have an oldish man coming into the throne, inevitably with a relatively short reign, and then we're going to have a young monarch come in, and it's that young monarch in a way, William, that you should be watching because he's the one that's going to take the monarchy forward. And what his grandmother did, he now will have to do again to ensure that it survives and that England, Britain doesn't become a republic.
Professor Donald McCracken, thank you very much for your time. He's a historian from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. When Queen Elizabeth II made only her second and last visit to the United Nations in New York in 2010, she used an opportunity in front of the General Assembly to highlight the important role of the global organization, her recent Platinum Jubilee celebrations. On that last visit to the UN, she spoke about the new challenges the world faced and the changes she had witnessed over her 96-year lifetime. In this report, Sherwin Bryce Pease takes us on a trip down memory lane.
It was a glamorous arrival at UN headquarters in the autumn of 1957, in her early 30s, but already after 6 years on the throne, with the message then to the General Assembly that the future of the organisation would be determined not only by the degree to which its members observed the Charter, but also by the strength of its people's devotion to the pursuit of those ideals. Fast forward 53 years to 2010, accompanied then by her late husband Prince Philip, welcomed by then UN Chief Ban Ki-moon.
Your reign spans the decades, from the challenges of the Cold War to the threat of global warming, from the Beatles to Beckham, from the television to Twitter. Through the years, you have traveled the world and met its people. You have become a living symbol of grace, constancy, and dignity.
The British monarch at 84 talked then about how much had changed in the world, but also about how some things simply endure.
I have also witnessed great change, much of it for the better, particularly in science and technology and in social attitudes. Remarkably, many of these sweeping advances have come about not because of governments, committee resolutions or central directives, although all these have played a part, but instead because millions of people around the world have wanted them. For the United Nations, these subtle yet significant changes in people's approach to leadership and power might have foreshadowed failure and demise. Instead, the United Nations has grown and prospered by responding and adapting to those shifts.
She touched on the challenges of the Millennium Development Goals which preceded the SDGs, climate change and terrorism, and also praised those gathered for their leadership and public service.
I started by talking about leadership. I have much admiration for those who have the talent to lead, particularly in public service and in diplomatic life. And I congratulate you, your colleagues, and your predecessors on your many achievements. It has perhaps always been the case that the waging of peace is the hardest form of leadership of all. I know of no single formula for success, but over the years, I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm and their inspiration to work together.
ascending to the throne in 1952 when the UN was just 6 years old. And a first meeting at the United Nations in 1957, meaning that this is a relationship that has endured for almost 65 years, with the current Secretary-General Antonio Guterres expressing only admiration and respect for the British monarch as she now marks 70 years on the throne. Sherwin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Sherwin Briceby's on the late Queen's last visit to the United Nations. Let's get more reaction now, and we do have on the line the Archbishop of the Anglican Church, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba. Arch, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Your reaction?
Good evening, Vuyo. My reaction is on behalf of the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. I would like to send our heartfelt condolences to the British people and to all those in the Commonwealth for whom the Queen was the head of state. And may Queen Elizabeth II rest in peace and rise in glory. And we send our greetings to the new King and his consort, and pray that God will sustain him and his people in the days to come.
And of course, I mean, the Anglican Church in South Africa has its roots, so to speak, in England. And on a day like this, you know, someone like you, who's now the head of the church in Southern Africa, what does this person and what she stood for over the decades represent? She really represented a deep Christian, somebody of great humility, and somebody with a great degree of simplicity. But she took her faith very dearly and very seriously. And we want to number her with those that have done so over the years. And interestingly, today we celebrate in the Christian calendar the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and how appropriate that she is called to her Lord and Savior on a day when we celebrate the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Well, Arch, let's thank you very much for your time this evening. And that's Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, the head of the Anglican Church in Southern Africa. Now, Queen Elizabeth II this year, of course, marked 70 years on the British throne. The Platinum Jubilee celebrations were in full swing in London and in some Commonwealth countries. Now, one of the prominent features of her reign had to be the Queen's crown, and that it had stood the test of time. Here's Kaelihle Khumalo.
It's called the Imperial States Crown, and it represents the sovereignty of the British monarch. The crown is made up of over 2,900 precious stones, including the Cullinan diamond that was sourced in South Africa in 1905. The Cullinan produced several stones, including one of the largest clear-cut diamonds in the world, the Great Star of Africa. The celebration of the Platinum Jubilee has started in earnest in the British capital, London.
So to begin with, we've got the 1953 coronation dress, and that kind of moves through into the Order of the Garter mantle, and obviously the Imperial State Crown. And we also have, again, more of her well-known dresses, such as the yellow dress which she wore in 2018.
Queen Elizabeth II has worn the crown numerous times throughout her reign, including at her coronation in 1953. Recently, the Queen quipped that you don't look down to read the speech if you're wearing the iconic crown. You just have to hold the speech up, because if you do look down, your neck would break and it would fall off. British politicians are mindful that the Queen is marking this milestone without her beloved Duke of Edinburgh.
We know that these celebrations will be tinged with sadness for Her Majesty by the absence of the Duke of Edinburgh, her strength and stay. And so I hope in the coming days that we can together further comfort her and reassure her, and show with every bonfire, with every concert and street party and aerobatic display, a love and a devotion to reciprocate the love and devotion and leadership she has shown to the whole country over 7 decades.
70 years is unprecedented for a British monarch. The Queen is record-breaking, groundbreaking. When we think back to her accession, young 20-something woman, we think back to 1950s Britain, and now 70 years on, so much has changed, but she remains.
The Queen has been seen in public only on few occasions after she spent a night in hospital last year for an unspecified illness, after which she was told to rest by her doctors. Kylie Kumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
The incoming king, Charles, has of course also issued a statement. His Majesty the King, at the time of the Queen's death, the death of my beloved mother, it reads, Her Majesty the Queen is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. We mourn profoundly the passing of a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. I know her loss will be deeply felt throughout the country, the realms and the Commonwealth, and by countless people around the world. During this period of mourning and change, my family and I will be comforted and sustained by our knowledge of the respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. A very short statement from the incoming king. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has also issued a statement saying, it reads, as the United Kingdom's longest lived and longest reigning head of state, Queen Elizabeth II was widely admired for her grace, dignity, and dedication around the world. She was a reassuring presence throughout decades of sweeping change, including the decolonization of Africa and Asia and the revolution, or evolution rather, of the Commonwealth. Queen Elizabeth II was a good friend of the United Nations and visited our New York headquarters twice, more than 50 years apart. She was deeply committed to many charitable and environmental causes and spoke movingly to delegates at the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow. I would like to pay tribute to Queen Elizabeth II for her unwavering, lifelong dedication to serving her people. The world will long remember her devotion and leadership. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, also paid tribute to Queen Elizabeth, praising her for her clarity of thinking, capacity for careful listening, inquiring mind, humor, and extraordinary kindness. As we grieve together, we know that in losing our beloved Queen, we have lost the person whose steadfast loyalty, service, and humility has helped us make sense of who we are through decades of extraordinary change in our world, nation, and society, the head of the Anglican Communion said in a statement. Lord Jonathan Oates from the UK House of Lords says, as the British Queen Elizabeth II celebrates a platinum jubilee, many around the world will be watching with interest to see how the royal family puts on a brave face and portrays a united front. The family was mired in controversy due to the decision of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to move to America. Prince Andrew was also embroiled in a scandal. In fact, our international news editor, Sophie Mugwena, is here with me, keeping me company. Sophie, good evening. Well, I mean, on a day like this, it gets very, tricky. On the one hand, I mean, there's people from all over the world, paying their tribute, but there's the history that we have with the British monarch. I mean, earlier, Kylie Kumalo, about that story about, the crown, once again taking us back to that history. And contradictions are bound to swirl on a day like this, because you simply cannot ignore that history.
Yes, indeed. That's what life is all about. I mean, you cannot erase history. The reality is colonialism was just bad. And it is during her reign where the countries that were under the colonial rule were suffering. And therefore, you understand when people have these mixed feelings in terms of how they should respond to what has happened. But the reality also is that she did try during her reign to ensure that she comes out clear in terms of pushing that her country does think in terms of how they were going to interact with the then apartheid government. I pointed out earlier on that they at some point in time had a frosty relationship with Margaret Thatcher, because Margaret Thatcher was pro-apartheid government, and she had reservations. A historian in Lesotho was able to relate that story in one of the packages that we did in Lesotho during the Jubilee. The historian pointing out that at that time he was the representative of Lesotho in the United Kingdom, and when the formalities were done receiving him, that's what the Queen told her, that they had an issue with Margaret Thatcher because she was opposed to continuation of the apartheid system that was brutalizing black people in particular. So it's understandable. But also, you look at the humor. I mean, it was after the passing on of Princess Diana that the two kids, when they were still very young, William and Harry, went to Lesotho. The very touching thing where they had a relationship, William having a relationship with King Letsie, who is currently the head of state of Lesotho, and Harry having a relationship with Morena Seiso, Beren Seiso, and that relationship is continuing. So in life, you have these contradictions, but because we are human beings, we end up having to share a common interest. And today, we have a foundation called Sintibali. Sintibali means don't forget me or forget me not. And that foundation, it was established by both Harry and Morena Seiso wa Lesotho, paying tribute to their parents. And today that foundation is assisting orphans in South Africa, in Botswana, and the other parts of Africa.
In fact, I mean, what you just said, I mean, Sophie, reminds me of, I mean, a while ago, covering the state visit of former President Thabo Mbeki in the UK, and how, you know, her difficult, you know, the monarch's difficult relationship with its former colonies, and how difficult as it was. I think the sense, certainly from former President Thabo Mbeki, was that she actually did admirably to, you know, acknowledge the past, but also try as best as she could to really make new connections, to really try and forge new relations with former colonies. But I do remember, you know, from analysts and historians at the time, many still felt that she actually didn't do enough with all the power she actually had.
Yes, indeed. And you are aware that President Thabo Mbeki was in exile in the United Kingdom, and therefore he is very familiar in terms of the establishment in that country. And, you know, he has this Pan-African ideology and outlook in terms of issues. But as a head of state of South Africa, what he was supposed to do. And I think the historians and us journalists and analysts, we are supposed to do our work and critique any story that comes up. And therefore, I think it was befitting, perhaps, for the analysts and the historians to ask hard questions. This is the reality. And therefore, when you come to the government relationship between countries, you have a different story. But I am sure if you can go and speak to Thabo Mbeki today, he's got lots of very interesting stories around what happened pre-1994 and 1994 when he was in the presidency, when he interacted with heads of state and government. And I think he can perhaps this time around share more information in terms of what he said to the Queen. And also the former president, Halima Mtlanti, didn't have that close interaction. It was the G8 then and now G7 in London. And of course, former President Jacob Zuma also. How can I forget President Cyril Ramaphosa? So it's all in the nature of politics and government to government, Vuyo.
Of course, I mean, you've just reminded me, I mean, Sophie, I mean, London had one of the most vibrant, chapters of the anti-apartheid struggle. I mean, people who would take to the streets who have protests, but also raise money for the anti-apartheid movement.
Yes, indeed. Who can forget that march that was led by the very same former President Thabo Mbeki, calling on the international community to do something to stop the then apartheid government when there were reports that the Rivonia trialist, Madiba, Katrada, Mbeki and many others were going to be hanged. And therefore, you are correct, the relationship between South Africa during exile years was also a relationship where there was support. Who can forget the concerts, trying to mobilize and conscientize the international community about the struggle in South Africa. And therefore, this is the nature of history.
So from Gwena, let's leave it there for now as I take our viewers to the United Kingdom now. That's where we have Lord Jonathan Oates from the UK House of Lords. Good evening and thank you very much for your time. In the House are the conversations on this evening, Lord, on the back of the news we had over an hour ago or so?
Good evening. Obviously, there is a sense of profound sadness in the House and indeed, I think, across the country. I've just come back from paying my respects outside Buckingham Palace, where, as your coverage was probably showing, crowds are gathering at the moment in the evening and the rain. This is a very momentous day for the United Kingdom. For most of us, the Queen has been on the throne for all of our lives. So it is with a sort of profound sense of shock and sadness, albeit that obviously she was 96 and not in the best of health. But I think over the next few days and weeks, the country will be really remembering somebody who gave great service and who will be dearly missed.
Of course, I mean, you have a tradition there of, the monarch staying away from politics, yet which is something, that earned, the monarch a great deal of respect, even among politicians.
Yes, I mean, as head of state, the Queen plays a very different role, obviously, from the head of state in South Africa, who's also the head of government. And I noted that your previous conversation was, your correspondent was talking about the power that the Queen had. Actually, she has very little power. In fact, her role in the Constitution is described as being able to advise her prime ministers, to warn them and to encourage them. But ultimately, she does not have a power beyond that. The power of government resides with the elected House of Commons and the Commons and Lords in the Parliament assembled. And so I think one has to understand that role. In the context of South Africa, it was very widely reported that the one area of disagreement behind the scenes that she had with the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was over the imposition of mandatory economic sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. I think she had strong views about that, but she expressed them behind the scenes and I think played a role hopefully, in moving the position of the United Kingdom.
What were those views?
Well, her great skill as a monarch was to keep them to herself because she didn't have a political role to play. That's for people to decide in elections and for their elected representatives. But obviously, she had a huge experience of her many years on the throne. She had visited, I believe, more countries than any head of state ever. She knew many of the figures around the world during that time of the apartheid government. She had strong relationships with many of the presidents of the frontline states, and she felt very strongly about the role of the Commonwealth, and clearly the Commonwealth was absolutely rightly determined that there would be freedom and majority rule in South Africa. And although she obviously couldn't publicly express views, I think through her relationship with those frontline presidents, she really helped bring the Commonwealth together in that united position.
Do you think that's what did the trick? In other words, that's how she was able to preserve, the dignity of the monarch by keeping to herself and stating her views perhaps firmly behind the scenes, but never the one to go out and air those views?
I think that's absolutely right. I think that was what gave her almost universal respect. And even for people who are not monarchists in this country, I think a lot of people had respect for her as a person and for the way she carried out her role. And I think it's critical in a system, in a democracy which has an unelected head of state, that unelected head of state understands that although she, with her experience, may advise, warn and encourage, as I said, ultimately the decisions lie in the hands of elected politicians. I think that's quite right. She respected that absolutely. But she was very, very diligent in her weekly meetings with her prime ministers throughout her reign. I think there were 14 of them over that period, the first of whom was Winston Churchill in the 1950s. So she had a great deal of experience. She gave the benefit of that experience to her prime ministers and to other senior members of her government. But she always knew that ultimately it was for them to make the decisions.
Lord Jonathan Oates, thank you very much for your time this evening. He's from the UK House of Lords. Of course, I am about to walk out as I usher in Peter Ndoro, who's going to continue with our rolling coverage following, of course, the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, who this year celebrated her platinum jubilee. Many around the world will be watching, of course, with interest to see just how the royal family, takes things. I mean, from here, lots to talk about for you over the next 3 hours.
Do you know what? Vuya, this is a momentous, historic moment in the history of the United Kingdom, the entire Commonwealth, but everybody in England right now, I can tell you, is on pause and in shock because most of the Britons that are alive right now only ever knew her as the Queen. And when we look back at her life, 15 prime ministers came to Buckingham Palace to be anointed by the Queen. Winston Churchill. I mean, we write history stories about people like Winston Churchill. And there's a people. And she was part of that history. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for people to think about a UK without the Queen. Charles, yes, he's king now, and Camilla is Queen Consort. But this is a huge loss for British life. And the next 2 days, if you saw the outpouring of grief when Prince Philip died, this is going to be on a magnitude that nobody's ever seen before in terms of a monarch passing away. This is huge.
Of course, but also, I mean, with our own history.
Yeah.
You know, historians are going to reflect on her reign.
Yeah.
They are going to reflect on her relationship with the continent, and us as South Africans are going to reflect on the monarch's relationship, you know, with us, with the history we all know too well. I'm going to leave you to it, but let's of course look at this package. The family recently has been mired in controversy due to decisions, or the decision rather, of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to move to America. Prince Andrew was also embroiled in a scandal. So there are so many things to talk about, but no one's better than our international news editor, Sophie Mugwana, to look at the Queen's visits to our country since 1947. Take a look.
Following day marked Princess Elizabeth's coming of age, and a public holiday for Cape Town, the centre of worldwide rejoicing. Very appropriately, the Princess took the salute at a youth rally and thoroughly enjoyed a lively display. Climax of the occasion was the children's version of a familiar birthday greeting.
The young Elizabeth, accompanying her parents, King George VI, and her mother, Queen Elizabeth I. Here, reading a speech on the 21st birthday that coincided with her visit in South Africa. It is on this continent in Kenya, during her visit in 1952, where the young Elizabeth, a newlywed, got a message from her husband, Prince Philip, that her father, King George VI, has passed on.
The tragic news reached Princess Elizabeth and her husband while in Kenya, and the new Queen left immediately for London. Sad homecoming of a young Queen. The Atalanta was punctual, and bearing a message from the Queen Mother, the Duke of Gloucester entered the plane. And then, bravely concealing her emotions, Queen Elizabeth II emerged. With perfect composure, she greeted the Prime Minister and all who had come to meet her. Her Majesty graciously thanked the crew of the Atalanta, and only a few minutes after the arrival, she and the Duke of Edinburgh said goodbye to Mr. Churchill and left the airport for Clarence House.
The incident that completely changed her life. She was back at the southern tip of the continent again in 1995 during the presidency of the late former President Nelson Mandela, and setting her foot in Cape Town again, where she made a prophetic speech on her 21st birthday, returning to this country, now being a queen and the head of the Commonwealth. Former President Mandela also visited Buckingham Palace. And to Madiba, she was just Elizabeth.
The President of the Republic of South Africa and Her Majesty, the Queen.
The Queen later returned to South Africa during the Commonwealth Summit that was hosted by Madiba's successor, Thabo Mbeki, who was then a head of state of South Africa.
Mr. President,
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, President Mandela and Mrs. Graça-Machel.
Mbeki also visited Buckingham Palace in the year 2000. Former President Kgalema Motlanthe met the Queen in 2009 at the G20 summit. Jacob Zuma, the former president, also met the Queen in 2010, while the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, met the Queen in 2018. This is a tradition within the Commonwealth family to meet the Queen at the Buckingham Palace when heads of state and government are on the state visit to the United Kingdom. Sophie Mugwana, SABC News, Johannesburg.